I think, Andrea, that in the movie or in the previous talks of my colleagues from the industry, I think there is a way of actually systematizing really the definition of the value for rare disease drugs. It's looked by looking at some key components of really what's the impact and therefore the value determinants of drugs and diseases. And when you look at overall the impact of these diseases, I mean, one of the key features is, number one, premature death. You see that the mortality in all these diseases is actually very early in life. So 30 million Europeans today, you know that 30% of the rare disease patients will not see their 5th birthday. So this is already a very important value determinant in really trying to understand what could be the value of drugs and rare disease. What you also see is that today you have 7,000 rare disease. You have basically the drugs which are approved today are only 1% they covered 1% of the diseases. So it means that the future of value of rare disease treatments as well is probably not in comparing to existing treatments, because we are living with situations where there are desperate need for new treatments. But it's also indeed probably to understand better the natural history of disease and the progression of the disease, which is a big challenge. You look then at the intellectual deficiency that these diseases are bringing. This is another very important key feature of rare diseases. 50% of these diseases today, they basically means for patients intellectual deficiency. And the fourth one is basically impact for patients and families. There is a social component in this disease that we have seen through this movie in particular. 60% of the families will lose their revenue because of rare disease. 1 family in 6 will need to move house because of rare disease. What about the social consequences for the family? So at the end of the day, there is actually an impact on the earnings and education potential capabilities of both the patients and the families that needs to be taken into account. And we believe that there are really systematic ways of really aggregating these value elements. It's probably also a function of really having a clear dialogue between all the stakeholders. But I would say that the first step is probably defining the key determinants and specifics of a rare disease. So that's it helps actually to set the base for qualifying and determining the value of the treatment.
Thanks, Verika. Please.
The reason I showed you the film was that this chap, Andy Barwick, is suffering from neurobeschets. The main thing is he actually doesn't look ill, but he is seriously ill. I think the one thing coming from the UK is that I think we dislike as patient groups is the NICE guidelines and the NICE organisation. It tends to be very confrontational, and it tends to be a them and us, where the regulators are there trying to stop you to get drugs, and we're there as patient groups trying to get the patients to have the drugs. We prefer, and recently we've been to Agnes, and I was one of the people fortunate enough to go there, and we've come up with, we think, a template which the patients will use in order to key in really things that, as far as the drug's concerned, actually change their lives. Not clinical effect, but how they change their daily life, how it changes their children's lives, how it changes their partners' lives. We feel that's more important. Before I come, I had a check of the NICE guidelines, and of all the orphan drugs, they've only said yes to 5. They've only given 5 indications where it can be used. And if you look at all the orphan drugs that are in circulation, we as a patient group do not think that's very acceptable. There are other that the national commissioning from Agnes that actually commission as well and provide for, but we still feel that it's a long time to wait. People like Andy Barwick can't wait 10 years, they can't wait 5 years, they can't wait 2 years. They needed a drug yesterday. So I think the message that I would give is that we need, and it's been here today already, is flexibility and working together. And I think the patient's voice has long been not heard.
Segolene, please.
I am going to be very straightforward. I think that currently the orphan drug issue is facing a crisis because you are a victim of the success of the regulation. And the fact that a lot of people who are not specialized have a wrong perception of what is going on. And we need to re-establish the facts and give and really work together to have the right message to these people who think wrongly. The first perception is that there are 7,000 diseases, and if we multiply the cost of the 250 first ones with a drug by 7,000, you know, it seems like any country will go bankrupt. And I think we have to discuss that with patient organization, of course, but in fact, I have really looked at that in details. It's wrong to really put forward too much this message that there are thousands of diseases, because among them, a lot of them are just, not just, but are due to what we call private mutations, which means that a mutation occurred once in a family, once in the family and maybe in the neighborhood, but it will never recur as such in another population. So these patients were, let's say, reported in the literature, but since no one else has ever seen another family with the same disease. So these ones are usually, let's say, developmental defects and are not really amenable to a treatment by a drug. So if we suppress these, let's so-called private conditions, we suppress almost 3,000 of diseases. Then we are left with 3,000. And among the 3,000, we know from the mechanism of these diseases whether they are easily to target or not, because if let's say the disease expressed later enough, not at birth but later in life, it's likely that there is something to do. And if you do that, you suppress at least half of the diseases. So it's 1,500. And I would say that if you look at the distribution of prevalence, it's like there is about 1,200 diseases which are probably targets for drugs and probably recurrent in all the populations, so are really the diseases that we should consider. So 1,200 is not 6,000 first, okay? And then if you look at the classifications, you can see that a lot of diseases are close to one to another. So you can think that some solutions, therapeutic solutions, will apply to more than one disease. So in fact, you reduce the burden or let's say the workload, and it becomes, you know, more acceptable for health authorities, for the payers, if you come with you know, figures which are not too huge, because at the present time, I think it's a barrier to the acceptance of putting more resources in the field, because they are really afraid of having to face too many, you know, new drugs and for a cost which will not be bearable anymore. So I think that would be my first message, is maybe that we should modify a bit what we say and not claim that there are 6,000 diseases which should have, you know, a treatment once. That's for me is very wrong.
Thanks a lot, Segolene. I think I got from, just as a first run, a few elements that are extremely interesting. One, I think Pierrick was stressing this fact, you know, look really the impact in terms of, especially because they are all kids, we are talking about genetic disease. So the impact is not the disease on the individual patients as such, as could be, I don't know, whatever other type of acute disease, but the impact is immediately on the family, on the caregivers. And it's not only a simple impact, but means really sometimes rethinking the way of your future. And I think it's something that makes a person with no disease from a person with a disease is really the loss of control of their future. You know, I know what I will do next summer. I can plan my next 5 years. I can take a mortgage. If I'm diagnosed with a cancer, I cannot do it anymore. I lose the control of my future. And I think, you know, that's happened on family because, you know, got kids and you have this complete different different approach. And the other one on the mortality, in terms of seeing not the mortality for the people that is more in the clinical or research area as a simple, not simple, but let's say it's a basic endpoint of a clinical trials, but also look at the expectation of life. You talk about the 5th birthday. Many of these patients, they can see, so what could mean in terms of life expectancy and moving the target. I also think, Richard, you said about the abandoning the space of very confrontational when we discuss about access. I think it's not only nice. I think it's growing. What I measure, you know, there was this idea at the beginning for the people who was there at the launch of the regulation that actually most probably there wouldn't have been never major issues in terms of access because you were talking about few patients, because the ethical consideration. Few patients, I mean the rarity of the condition, and whenever you measure in different exercises the so-called budget impact on the healthcare, you never get big numbers. You know, you can talk about 2–3%, you know, very small. But there is a cultural difficulties in accepting of diverting resources for few people. I think this is really an increase this confrontational space. And then you, Segolene said, which is very important, back to the, let's talk what we are talking. You know, we can use big numbers. By the end of the day, the reality is most probably by treating some of them, we got lots of learning in terms of scientific learning or knowledge that we can share for other products. So that's my taken from this first. Is any thoughts in the audience? Anything that we want now? Please. If you can introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Gregory Tutton. I'm here with Czech Orphan and with a marketing group behind Czech Orphan that did something that will be presented tomorrow. The word collaboration keeps coming up. It's come up in every presentation that's been made so far. So it's one question that if each of you could address from your perspective, are there any real-world present examples from the patient side of a successful collaboration with industry and government, or from the industry side with government and with patients, or as expected from the government perspective with industry and patients? We've seen some excellent previews of models, some excellent ideas on new models. We've seen the need for new models. Are there any current models that could be further adapted?
Please, if you want to.
So one concrete example of, for us is basically the latest partnerships that we had with the charity Teleton Fund in Italy on a gene therapy treatment. This was actually a treatment which was initiated thanks to the Teleton initiative in Italy by a group of researchers, so academics, patients, and GSK basically we partnered with this group recently, end of 2010. We think this is a very innovative technology, a very complex technology. We are talking about 200 patients in Europe, so you can see that the challenge of really conducting clinical trials and having really a strong development program with such a limited patient population, but a high medical need. And we believe really the technology and the partnership with the patient group and the charity was really something that could be done. I think this is really this is one of those initiatives that we have set up really as a new group within GSK, and we believe this is probably one of the way forward as well. So broaden really partnerships and scientific initiatives with all stakeholders when it is actually possible.
And I can also say that, for instance, for Orphanet, we have a close relationship with GSK, and we started about now 1.5 years ago to have a dialogue. And for us, it was very interesting to listen to the needs of people developing innovative drugs and to know what, in terms of data and information, was expected, because if we do what we do as academics, it's to ensure that patients at the end will have therapy, and that goes through the necessity of industry to find its way. So it's very valuable for us to understand the needs, and it's, I think, very valuable also for industry to understand what could be developed jointly. So I think that's also an example of a successful partnership.
I think I can give you one which is one for our organisation, the Behçet Syndrome Society. We're going through national specialist commissioning at the moment, and so we're waiting on Agnes to decide as to whether we can have centres of excellence for Behçet's. And I think one of the issues that we had when we submitted our report was that we weren't sure we actually got across to them exactly what, from a patient's point of view, what the illness was like and how a centre would change the patient's benefit. However, just recently we've been back now with Agnes because of an application made for a drug that was carried on by Shire, which was the presentation before. And the lady who presented on behalf of the patients' organisation obviously presented an excellent document which related to how the drug impacted upon the patient, the carers, the family and everyone. And as a result of that, I think the implication is that attitudes changed, that Agnes actually said, well, actually, this is fantastic. This is what we really need. And it was Josie's slide was top of the pile. It's the patient presentation that really impressed them, that was lacking before. So I think we're making progress. It is slow, but I think there's some real, it does show that there can be a real impact if patients have more of a voice.
It's great. There's a question there, please. If you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, Noam Kizilbash from Oxon Epidemiology. I'd like to ask the panel about the clinical value. If it's been suggested that clinical trials are not optimum, that we should be looking at things like observational trials, and I assume that that comes from the premise that the benefits need to be quite large in these patient groups because the trials are going to be limited in number, and therefore it's unlikely that you'll be able to pick up small or medium-sized effects. Therefore, we're looking for big effects, either on the real clinical outcome or on surrogate outcomes. If that's the case, then the clinical trial can still work, but it means that if the benefits are large, then the areas of bias are less important, and so one could actually look at comparative trials which are not strictly randomized. And I would wonder what the panel's view on that is, and if these benefits are so large, then also the effects on the health economics becomes of less relevance, because you're looking at real big clinical benefits which will swamp out any issues about whether this is slightly cost effective or not. It will clearly have an impact on total cost and budget impact, but not necessarily on the cost effectiveness in relation to looking at cost effectiveness ratios and distributing resources to one group versus another. Thank you.
So we agree that clinical value is actually one of the critical components. The challenge with rare disease treatments and programs, as you pointed out, is, and this is where the patient groups are extremely important stakeholders, is, these diseases are very difficult to understand. You have a real lack of epidemiology around this disease, which makes actually the development and the design of clinical development programs quite hard, of which really how to define the relevant outcome that will actually have a clinical benefit for the patient. So very often you're dealing with a genetic marker, and one of the benefits of really collaborating with patient groups, patient associations, but also having this dialogue with the regulators and experts is try to define very early in the process really what could be your relevant surrogate marker for really being central to your study. So what the design of the studies is always a challenge, and it's true that you will not always be able to document in the right way as you would do it from common diseases, the trials, of which the importance of having a continuum. So what is very important is to have actually also the ability to monitor the impact of the drug once it is approved, And so what we see really in the clinical development program for us is really a continuum and a partnership with experts and regulators and patient groups, so to inform very early upstream in the development programs, the design of the trials, the choice of the relevant endpoints, and also post-approval to be able to document basically in real life for some of the studies when it's not possible to document an expanded impact of the drug. So this is a big challenge, and there's definitely need for a continuum dialogue in this clinical, the clinical program, and actually the assessment as well of the clinical value of the drug.
To answer your question, if you look at the designs of the trials which have been conducted in the past 10 years in Europe, half of them are not classical trials. So it's acceptable, of course, and, but you know that a lot of decisions are taken on very soft data, and so it's why it is so important to now envisage that all the post-marketing studies are done in a way which will provide all the evidence that not only the regulators require, but also the payers. And so we really think that it's why it's so important that we establish disease registries together, because we have to build trust with payers, and for that we need to be able to show, you know, the benefit, long-term benefit and real outcome. So I think that we cannot escape making a big effort in setting up, you know, data repository, meaningful ones, accessible to all stakeholders. And it's a challenge, but it's really feasible. The technology is there. I mean, it's just a matter of having good governance of the registry, and this is really something that we can achieve. So that, for me, this is a way forward. We should take, let's say, all the requests from regulatory bodies and from the payers as an opportunity, you know, to go further and establish good partnerships.
I've actually recently taken part in a clinical trial, and I think they missed a trick, and I'm not sure whether they could have done it or not, but from a patient's point of view, we had to fill in smiley boxes as to how I felt, and smiley boxes how the clinician who didn't know what drug I was on, how they thought I felt about myself, which was a bit mind-blowing, but I think they could have done it a lot better, and what they could have done and should have done, I think, was to say, well, actually, what benefit has this had on you as a person? What can you now do? What can't you do? How has it improved your life? And if I give you an example, I heard recently of one person that their lung function capacity raised by 2 or 3%. Now, from a clinical point of view, I think it went from 8 to 11, something like that. From a clinical point of view, it wasn't very much. But from a patient point of view, it meant that the person wasn't on a respirator. It meant that they could do so much more in their life. They could actually move about. It was a fantastic achievement for them, and it really made such a difference. So I think if you allow us, if you work with us as patient groups, I think it will increase your chances of actually proving that your drug works and it is of a benefit, really great benefit to the patients.
Yeah. Mike, please.
Yeah, Remco de Vru, sorry, Dutch Steering Committee on Orphan Drugs. Working for this Dutch Steering Committee, in which we have all the stakeholders, it's always very fascinating to have a discussion between a reimbursement agency representative, a health insurance company representative, as well as the industry. And at the end of the discussion, it's always the feeling everybody is right. But I also have the feeling, how can we break through this situation? Because what I now hear is that we are moving around the situation, and I noticed there was a presentation on the devil's advocate, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate. What we haven't put into this equation is the cost, and the cost of development is an issue. And when you talk to industry, they put in a lot of numbers. When you talk to health insurance companies and reimbursement agencies, they say, well, that's too much. Again, I don't know who's right, but we need to get that discussion ongoing. But that was not my question. That was a statement, by the way, Mr. Chair. My question is, if we look at drug development costs, and for instance, there has been a paper in June, I think, in the Orphan Journal of Rare Disorders, or Rare Diseases, I apologize if I quoted wrong, by Ayme, in which he focuses on ultra-rare disorders and he shows certain models in ways to lower the cost of development. I think that will create a lot of awareness, if that works, will create a lot of awareness with health insurance companies and reimbursement agencies, that you can also show to them, yeah, but we can also lower the price, instead of what the message at the moment is, the prices are only going up, up, and up. That doesn't mean that I don't agree that we shouldn't pay for it. That's another matter. It's a matter of, okay, how can we fine-tune this discussion? Because at the end, also in the Netherlands, we have a very nice reimbursement policy since 2006. Unfortunately, at the moment, with recession and Greece and Italy or whatever, the discussion is completely different now, and they are also looking at that. Although it's budget impact-wise, it doesn't matter at all. They're looking at everything that they can cut costs, especially healthcare costs. And the added value that was mentioned is one of the things that everyone's looking at the moment, especially from the political side. Because you can look at reimbursement agencies, but they don't make the decisions. It's the Ministry of Health that in the end has to make the decision and has to say, okay, we think this is worth or not. I'm not sure if I asked a question, but I'm sure you have an opinion.
Sounds like. Sounds like. At least, thanks a lot, Remco. Good provocation.
So for me, I mean, innovation is not against sustainability. I think this is one of the, that's basically the question you're asking, yeah? And I think this is actually possible to reconcile the two. What you clearly see, first of all, is to define really, again, we are coming back to the first question, which is, how do you define really the value of your drug? I mean, the price of your drug will be a function of the value that you deliver. And the value of these drugs might actually vary, and it would be possibly different according to the type of drugs you're dealing with and the disease and the benefit that you bring. So I think the first point is about really agreeing on trying to have a common framework on how we could actually define properly the same value in terms of baseline. I think this helps a lot to basically avoid misperceptions and try to calibrate how you could actually bring your incremental benefit. The second component in the equation is really looking indeed at the benefit of your drug in the context, I think, of what are the patient needs and the progression of the disease. And this is where I think we believe as well that the dialogue, again, as I mentioned before, is very important, because with rare disease, what you see very often is the difficulty of gathering really I would say what normal evidence that you would gather with more common disease, where you have more patients, where recruitment is easier, where it's less complex to conduct clinical trials. So this is also a very important component of the equation of really bringing back innovation towards sustainability. The third one is about really what you say is about the cost of development of a drug. I mean, the attrition rate in rare disease is an issue that we are dealing with in the same way the industry is overall dealing with. When you look at the number of orphan drug designations today, and in Europe or in the US, you look at the number of drugs which are approved, you clearly see two curves which are very, very different. And probably in the middle, one of the big drivers is the failure rates that you have and the challenge that you have in developing clinical trials. So it's very clear as well that in the same way you have challenges developing drugs for common diseases, you have actually the same challenges in rare diseases, and even more sometimes, by the fact that you have less knowledge about the epidemiology of the disease and all the markers that will help to define the appropriate endpoints. The last component for me is about really in the continuity of the dialogue. It's really about really looking at the implementation of the treatment. And it's true that you might come with a very, very high medical need and a very desperate situation for patients, and where your drug might actually bring, maybe with the evidence that you have, a marginal or moderate value. I think this is part of the dialogue and the continuity of the exchange with the payers and the governments to establish actually flexible systems that would allow us to actually monitor the impact of the drug in some instances, and we look at the value of this drug. So I think there are many components and many many elements that would actually help to make sustainability and innovation going together quite nicely. And at the end of the day, I think it's really very much about really understanding what the impact of the disease is, about understanding the value determinants, or trying to determine the same base for value determinants for the disease and the drug, and really have this continuous dialogue with regulators, with experts, and with payers, and with patients as well, because we realize that this is not an easy situation. So from a GSK point of view, it's very clear for us that our approach is really bring sustainability in the system, and really the price of our drugs will basically reflect their value, and it's not a given that every time will come with as you said, a very high price. So price is always relative to the value, and I think this is what we need to consider as well in the context of the budget and sustainability for the healthcare system and the payers. This is really the way we are approaching the approach in rare disease.
I'm very glad you asked that question, because I'd like to just quote from something. It's a very short quote, but I thought it was very interesting. It said, Professor Carol Sikora, who's the former head of cancer at WHO, said it was no longer viable to provide the best treatment to all patients free of charge, and that delivering new anti-cancer drugs would render the NHS penniless. 8 new drugs are due to be approved by the EU regulatory body before the end of November, and will cost the health providers, and he puts it, stonking amounts, he added. So I think there's always going to be a question about how much is everything costing. And if you look at just for that one issue of cancer drugs, where they're estimating that it's going to be £1 million per patient per year, there's always going to be a question that we all have to ask ourselves. And governments have to ask themselves, what are they prepared to spend on individual patients? So I haven't got the answer. I don't think anybody has, but I think we have to discuss it, and as long as we discuss it, then it's healthy.
I urge you to read a paper which was recently published in the Orphan Journal of Rare Diseases, the best journal, of course, which shows that the projection for the coming 10 years are in terms of cost, budget cost for the countries, is that often drugs will not cost more than 5 or 6% of the total budget for pharmaceuticals. And it is based on real data. And so I think that we have to be prepared to have all these figures in mind when we discuss with regulators and payers, because there are a lot of fears around our field which are totally wrong. I mean, and I hope that the discussions will go more around what is the contribution of drugs to the total budget than to the cost per patient, because of course you cannot compare the cost per patient for a rare disease and for a common disease. I mean, the market size is not the same. But this discussion is possible only if, if industry is also reasonable. I think that you are also suffering from the fact that there are a few black sheep. And that, and that's true. And so, I know after that, when the image is damaged, you know how difficult it is to recover from that. So I think that we all have our homework to do, but you have yours.
Okay, good. Yes, please, and then the lady. Or lady first. Let's do it. Lady first, yeah. Like. Ladies first? Yeah. Ladies first. I'm sure that you would agree.
Good morning. Thank you, Segolene. No, it was not a question, just a comment.
If you can introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, yes. I'm Karen Ayash from Lysogene. I think that one thing that should also be stressed when discussing with the payers is the dimension of investment that rare diseases represent for the whole community in terms of health. We all know that rare diseases are the diseases that are candidates to advanced therapies that would never be experienced otherwise. And the question is not the question of a price per patient, but also the question of how much health we are going to build by investing in rare diseases for other patients later.
Okay, thanks a lot. Please.
My name is Hans Schikan, CEO of Presenza. And actually, I would like to start with an example, then with a question. Yeah? The example is that a couple of years ago, there was a patient in Sweden treated in a hospital for MPS, and that patient costed that hospital about 1 million, I think, euro per year. It was a very, very expensive treatment. And the hospital decided to stop treatment. Right the day afterwards, on internet, there was a poll in the, I think, one of the famous or infamous Swedish newspapers on internet, and then they announced, should this patient live or die? And people were allowed to vote there. And then within 24 hours, I think some 75,000 Swedes voted he should live. Of course, I mean, it's obvious, I would say, eh? But still, so he got back to treatment, and the hospital then was reimbursing him. Now, my question now, that was the example. Now, the question is to the panel, also fueled by the presentations by Ken and Josie earlier, to what extent do you think that the public at large should have a voice in whether or not something should be reimbursed? I mean, in the UK, we had the Citizens' Council, where indeed normal people like we are allowed to vote on that topic. Because if you ask patients or parents, they will say automatically it should be reimbursed. And what about the public at large? What's your view on having in a system of assessing value and pricing then in the end as well, that the public should play a role there?
I can answer for the example of France, where on next Saturday we will, in a sense, vote whether we want to pay for the treatments for these patients through the Téléthon that we have every year. And you know, every year people give 100 million euros to develop new therapies for rare diseases. So I think that shows clearly that although people think that the public health authorities should be on the front line of putting money on research, they also think that citizens should contribute if they want to speed up research for rare diseases. So I think that the value which is put at the highest level everywhere for people is health. So people understand very well that these bloody diseases can occur in any family, that can happen to their grandchildren or children, and they want to contribute to fix the problem. So I think that if you ask the public, they will be ready to put more money on the health system than on defense or, you know, or agriculture or whatever. And it is shown by any poll. So.
Well, I'd say from me, from an industry point of view, is that of course, when you look at the impact of rare disease in particular, it's very clear that you need to have this social dimension integrated into the decision making. We believe this is really very, very key to be able to apprehend really the impact of these diseases and the value that these treatments could bring to the patients, the families, and the society. In which way are you doing it? I think it's really each country has its own system, has its own way of getting rid of care organized and interaction between the stakeholders. I think you have some interesting examples in some countries, but I think personally that this would remain really a local country decision, depending on the system and the way also the care is organized.
I think the reference in England is 1 in 17 have a rare illness. And I think they do have means of saying what they want to do about the healthcare system and how they want to spend their money. There's lay people representatives on Agnes, on NICE. If you look in the UK, the Prime Minister had a son with a rare illness. The last Prime Minister had a child with a rare illness. So I think it's very prevalent that people know what rare illnesses is about. Before I contracted my illness in 1995, I didn't know much about rare illnesses at all. And I think the message that we have to try and get across to the general member of the public is what is it like to live with a rare illness? And I think that's a message we've still got to get across.
Please.
Sue Millman from Euro Ataxia, a patient group, and also from Ataxia UK. Well, in fact, in the UK, NICE did ask a Citizens' Council what they thought about paying for whether the NHS should be prepared to pay premium prices for drugs to treat patients with very rare diseases. And there were 27 members of the ordinary general public on this Citizens' Council, and just over half of them thought that within certain conditions the NHS should pay that price, and a further 4 thought that actually it didn't matter what the conditions were, that they should always pay. So there was a very clear majority of ordinary citizens, and certainly from Ataxia UK's point of view, we find that when we talk to the general public, there is absolute sympathy, and that premium prices have to be paid because that's the cost.
That sounds interesting. I think you know, Remco, you open a chapter that is very important. What is my taking at this stage of this panel? Definitely, that's an issue to define which are the determinants or the component of a value, and most probably, I think again. This is for my other part of interest on health technology assessment in terms of broader term, not only dedicated to HTA. It's always interesting to look to the Anglo-Saxon experience. It's always interesting to look to NICE. It's not all about that. At the end of the day, you know, that's all another world that is more continental Europe or Latin America or other parts of the world that are looking at thinking to system in a different way. I think we have also to learn more from them, what they are doing. Major reform, AMNOG in Germany, now the post-mediated tsunami in France, if I can call like that, you know, so the rethinking and reattention of certain failure of the system. But I think the idea of, shall I say, in general, and especially for orphan drug, to reduce the effort of translate all in mathematical number, which means whatever it can be a Markov model or similar things, and try to start to see other components that are basic in an HTA. There can be the social, societal, the ethical, the impact on a family, on caregivers, which whenever you open an academic book on HTA, you found as pillars of it. So it's not adding to an HTA, but actually is exploding and not limiting. One of the things that I think suffer more orphan drugs today is that still HTA applied to orphan drugs became a quick systematic review of the existing literature, and you can assume what Pierrick, what Segolene, everybody say, you know, you're talking about phase 2, phase 3 trials, very unevenly distributed data, lots of anecdotal reports, spontaneous reports of doctors. The robustness, you know, is not 100% there. And then the temptation of applying standard health economics model, health outcomes model, because we always done like that, and so we continue to do like that. I think the great challenge it will be to address to the question you say, yeah, by the end of the day, someone has to pay. But whenever you want to pay, you have to understand what you're going to pay. And I think that understanding for the orphan drug has not yet been built. There's always been the temptation to go for the easiest way. Let's take what we've done in other sector, in other can be medical devices, can be whatever, and then we just replicate. If it worked there, well, let's replicate it. And actually there where the controversies, the tensions start to be, because what this means is the way of framing the elements that are needed to understand that value. I'm thinking something, I think Segolene, you refer, lots has been said about registries, but this is quite natural. But there's something more, in Europe, the EMA tried to launch, but not with big successful, whatever you want to call conditional approval, but became sometimes even for people that is in regulatory affair field, even much tougher than a normal, marketing authorization. But whatever can be a process that we can thinking in progressive licensing with a parallel and a mirror by a progressive access. Something that can be by generating through times, by generating evidences, where the marketing authorization is not an end point, but just a checkpoint through many other points that are needed to collect data, and in parallel to have something that would accompany this process. That's why I say progressive licensing, progressive access, or progressive reimbursement, where the more you increase the information, the more you feel comfortable in granting access or granting certain type. Most probably this is, it's just my taking, so it's a limited, partial, and most probably biased as all the things that came from one person. But I think by observational application, I think that something in that area can be still explored because it's still missed. It's still, we think there's one moment for the marketing authorization, the famous yes or not, and there is one moment for the reimbursement. And I think the more we put not only the dramatic, but we want to compress all the information that won't be there in that theoretical model, we can't leave the space of, you say, confrontational or controversies that we risk to generate. This is my thinking, but I think the need for way forward, moving forward, they should be in that area. So I'm looking around if there is any other end that would be. Lunch is not ready, so you can't hope if you make it shorter we go for lunch. You see, for the coffee break, but I really, because I think this is really the challenge of the next few years or few months. I have one question then for the panel. I profit for the again to Remco point. Is there a way that you see? We talk a lot about pricing. I don't know if we can talk about an orphan drugs business model. I think some people dare to write that also in peer review articles. But there was a model, definitely most probably developed in the 80s, that was touching not only the pricing or the commercialization, but also the way of doing research, the way of doing. In time of, as we said, we have more attention. I heard you, Pierrick, saying the sustainability, the partnership. Shall we understand that we are moving to another type of model compared to the traditional? Are we exploring through all this partnership approach different way that will reflect also in the way that this product will be made available? I don't want to use the word commercialized, but made available to patient or to healthcare system. So it's only about new partnership in the research, or there will be, or you can see, not as an example today, but new partnerships also in the way of making these drugs available?
Well, for us, it's very clear that in the rare disease environment, the only model that can apply to the huge medical need out there for really bringing solutions to patients and families is really partnership. And what it means, basically, I don't know if it's a new model and if it's versus a null model. I would say, for me, make it very, very simple. You look really at the challenge and the impact of this disease. You look at the magnitude of what needs to be brought, basically, to make sure that treatments are available for these patients as well. And the only way to do that, given the challenges and the complexity of bringing together really appropriate set of clinical data, is to go through partnerships with the regulators, the experts, patient groups, and payers, and have really a continuum. So it's not indeed that the market authorization is the end, and that you have a kind of a clustered discussions along the way. It's really a continuum. You still need to start early, build up the evidence together, and really monitor the impact of the drug. I think that's the only way forward to really bring really also good perceptions and solid-based evidence exchanges with our stakeholders. I think there's a lot of misperceptions today because maybe there was not enough dialogue. I don't know, but this is clearly the way forward.
Thanks, Pierrick. Any other comment? If you want to also, because you gave a good presentation, if you want to step in, don't feel isolated there.
I completely agree with Patrice. I think that the drugs have actually been developed. We have had orphan drugs. We've had 10 years of orphan drugs. I think the difficulty comes as a patient organisation is actually getting them. There seems to be a logjam, and certainly in the UK, if you look at the NICE guidelines, they've only looked at 5 orphan drugs. They've only designated 5 orphan drugs, authorised. So there's a logjam. People are wanting the drugs, but why can't they get hold of them? It's all about cost, I'm afraid. So I think we need to sit down again. We know that the system does work, it does produce orphan drugs, but it's very much now the thorny issue of pricing and access. And I think the only way to do that is, again, we've heard it, collaboration, we're talking about that.
But it's also about decreasing the cost of development if we want to decrease the cost. So it's why we really should be imaginative in looking at what can be considered as a pre-competitive area where we could share resources. And you know, when I see what you spent as companies on, let's say, collecting the data that the regulatory authorities require, I mean, compared to what is the cost of a patient registry run by academic teams, I mean, it's like 1 to 10 or 20, you know, in terms of budget. So there's a lot of waste of resources. I'm sorry for the CROs who are here, which are here because that's their business. But, you know, obviously we could cut a lot of expenses if we were more, let's say, imaginative, and if we establish a dialogue to see what could be done together. And, you know.
Could you perceive reducing the cost of clinical development as or could be considered having an indirect effect in lowering the quality of data? Because, you know, there is really how to identify the space where you can have this type of collaboration without compromising thinking, you know, what would be the reaction from a regulatory or a payer, no?
I think there are companies here which have the experience of, yeah.
Please.
Caroline Certi from Genzyme. Maybe I sound a little bit provocative, but I would say that lowering the cost of clinical trials today, it's dreamland. This is something that it's really, how will I say, we could aspire to that. Like registries, when we talk a little bit more, I agree with you entirely that registries are fundamental, and we have pioneered the use of registries in regulatory areas. But the ask of regulatory authorities, the ask of the payers, in terms even local specific data, look at the German requests. So this is bringing the cost of post-marketing commitment to accumulate evidence and cost of even including health economic and outcome, patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials, is bringing the cost of clinical trials not south, north. That is a reality, and I think that each of us that has experiences, I would say ourselves since 20 years, so quite an experience of working with rare diseases regulators, while we have found an extreme openness in regulators to understand novel ways of accumulating evidence, on the other day, the amount of data, the depth of data, it's enormous. And I would say that the cost of clinical development is not pre-registration. That's nothing. The cost, specifically if you access through exceptional circumstances the market through a very good discussion either with the EMA or even with FDA with a special protocol assistance or things like that, the cost comes afterwards, which speaks a lot, not to the Genzyme, the GSK, or the Shire of the world, but maybe I heard a nice colleague from Lysogene, so from the smaller companies. Sustainability is also sustainability of research. And this is something that, to me, I'm sorry to put a little bit of a cold shower, so clinical development is not costing less. It is costing more. What is interesting that Segolene said, which I marry completely, and I think that it's something that we should all do, it's accumulating experiences in a pre-competitive or in a smarter competitive environment. That could be a big move that, by the way, is bringing companies in total non-rare diseases area to discuss. We know better than I do, and you know, Andrea, very well, that in the outside of orphan diseases, there is a specific group that through innovative medicine initiatives, for instance, I'm the vice chair of that initiative with the European Commission, tries to lower the cost of development to cure by sharing pre-competitive data. So what is feasible in a non-orphan disease maybe is a little bit more complicated in an orphan disease because of smaller intellectual properties and the return on investment, but can be experimented there. So I just wanted to share a little bit of our realistic comments.
Thanks a lot, Carlo. I see now that there's a gentleman here just there, and then these two gentlemen on the left.
Yeah, just also, I mean, there's a revision of the Clinical Trials Directive, and we're a member of the NCEP, and we've just made a response. There's a response from NCEP on observational studies to the Clinical Trial Directive, but it's still open as to what will happen to that, and it could affect observational studies. So the situation would not only continue to be bad for clinical trials in terms of the procedures, but also for the observational studies and including registries, which just to let you know that things may not get better.
Okay. 1, 2, yeah.
Hi, this is Charlie Richard from the Shire HGT. Just to also be a little bit provocative, I couldn't agree more. The cost of clinical trials just keeps spiraling upward. But I wonder if sometimes in industry we want it both ways. We work really hard with the regulatory agencies on surrogate markers likely to predict clinical benefit and work with them closely to try to get early registration of drugs so that we can start recognizing some income from that. But then when the post-marketing commitments come, we say, oh no, we can't possibly pay that, and that's too long and too expensive. And so my question is, the eternal one is, what's the balance between working with surrogate markers, conditional approval, and full approval, and how we shift the costs between those?
Okay. Can we take the gentleman and then we go back to the panel for the final...
My name is Jerry Zaldis. I work for Celgene. And we developed a drug, and we were a victim of its potency, at least in the EU. The drug, the majority of patients who you treat respond, and based on the phase 2 data, the drug was approved in the United States, Japan, and Switzerland, but not the EU. The EU has a mindset that they want a controlled trial, and the clinicians felt, based on the phase 2 data, it's unethical to do a controlled trial to the standard the EU wants. And so at this point, the 27 member states do not have an MAA for this drug. The question I have is, when is Europe going to accept a standard similar to the rest of the world? And is Europe smart and the rest of the world not smart?
We don't have regulators on so I think the three colleagues, they can answer what they think eventually, if they wanna, what will happen, just to be on the, but very clear question.
We can't agree more that indeed there is a need for harmonization of requirements in the field of rare disease across geographies. Because it's true that when you have to select patients, and for these very rare conditions, basically these patients are worldwide, and this is really global programs that you need to have in place. So adding really the complexity of really dealing with individual agencies' requirements at the country level, it adds actually to the complexity and the level of getting these treatments accessible to patients. So I think there are good initiatives these days between the US and Europe on the Orphan Drug Designation platform, which actually set, I think, the path forward for having really a closer harmonization of requirements across the agencies, and really, as well as really across stakeholders, discussions with patients, regulators, and experts to basically handle the challenges you just highlighted about really defining what are the right endpoints, the right trial design, and the right trial to be conducted in clinical trials.
So to respond to your question on whether we are smart or not, or who is smart, I think that it's very much dependent on the knowledge of the expert who is in charge of reviewing a dossier. And that's very unfortunate, because probably in the field of drugs, they should get a training first before they can, start working on this type of file. And maybe that's an idea that we could set up a nice training session that would be mandatory for experts at regulatory agencies to follow before giving an advice on an orphan drug. Something to look at.
It sounds like from a patient's point of view, it's a disaster. If some people around the world can have a particular drug and others can't, it seems to be a total inequality. So I think, I know Eurodis has certainly got a more closer relationship now with NORD, which is the North American organisation for rare diseases. And there is now, 29th of February next year will be the Rare Disease Day. So I think things are moving forward as far as patients are concerned, but I think maybe we as patients can help take up the cudgel on your behalf as well.